Okay, so I've got 15 minutes here to comment on each paper, so I'm going to start with Brian Leftow's paper. And the first thing I want to say is that I've got a conciliatory remark about his paper before I want to get into several of my criticisms. So I'm in full agreement with Leftow on a particular historical point. The classical Christian tradition is deeply committed to presentism. This traditional commitment to presentism has been obscured during the late 20th and 21st century debates over the A theories and B theories of time. And recent discussions within the philosophy of time have demonstrated that the A theories and B theories of time do not obviously entail any particular ontology of time as was once thought. So for instance, one could be a B theorist and hold to presentism, the growing block, or eternalism. And we have contemporary philosophers of time who defend the combination of each of these views. So that really muddies the water for theologians like myself who are trying to figure out, if God's timeless, how does this work on an A theory, how does this work on a B theory? If it doesn't entail any particular ontology of time, it's an absolute mess for a theologian to figure out. So I greatly appreciate Brian's focus on the compatibility of presentism and divine timelessness instead of the compatibility of divine timelessness with the A theory or the B theory, because that is a much more clear statement. So with that being said, now I want to get critical here. So I wish to bring out three critical issues. First, I believe the objection to divine timelessness from omniscience can be given more serious teeth when one considers recent work on the divine attribute of omnisubjectivity, or what's called knowledge by acquaintance. So as Leftow rightly points out, contemporary philosophers of religion have focused on the question, can a timeless God know what time it is now? And I think that's a very important question, but there's other relevant questions in the neighborhood that cause problems for divine timelessness. So St. Augustine and Peter Lombard, they once considered the question, does God's knowledge change when creation comes into existence? So you see, the classical Christian tradition is committed to the claim that there's a state of affairs where God exists without creation because God is the only being that lacks a beginning. Arthur W. Pink referred to this divine attribute as the solitariness of God. So with that in mind, you can return to Augustine and Lombard's question, does God's knowledge change when creation comes into existence? And it would seem that there has to be a difference in God's knowledge between two different states of affairs, God sans creation and God with creation. There's something that it is like to know or be acquainted with an object that actually exists. There's something that is like to experience a concrete universe that is wholly other than God. And that is not a type of knowledge that God can have from all eternity because the universe does not exist from all eternity. This brings me to my second critical issue. Leftow calls into question the assumption of time's way. And I find that rather interesting because it seems to me that the classical Christian tradition is deeply committed to time's way. After Aquinas died, there were several attempts by his contemporaries to discredit him because they wanted to say he was a heretic. And so one attempt was to say that Aquinas believed that all moments of time were literally in eternity. And this was a false interpretation of Aquinas because Aquinas, like Boethius and Anselm before him, they claimed that it was only as if all moments of time actually exist in eternity. But, once he's been condemned after he dies, the damage was done. And so loads of theologians after Aquinas' death, they felt the need to correct this misguided, Thomistic assumption that all of time literally exists in eternity. And the standard sort of like stock answer to this you can see in someone like Duns Scotus, who says that, look, it's not that all moments of time literally exist in eternity. A moment of time only exists in eternity when it is present, because when it was past, it didn't exist. And all those future moments, they don't yet exist. So a moment of time only exists in eternity when it is actually present. And this type of response is repeated by Protestant and Catholic scholastics well into the post-Reformation time period, and other thinkers such as like Samuel Clarke, again, they offer this exact sort of like textbook answer, all of which deeply assumes time's way. So if Brian wishes to stay very close to the classical Christian tradition, then it seems to me he would have to accept the assumption of time's way. Of course, if he wants to make modifications in order to maintain divine timelessness, he can do so, but he's going to be deviating from the classical Christian tradition. Okay, so third critical point. So Leftow has this sort of account of discrete time. And so he develops this model where God's timeless present is a time that is discrete from our temporal present. And he's discussed this in other writings as well, and I've always been curious as to how exactly this is supposed to work. So if these two times are truly discrete, they have no temporal relations with one another, why should we think that beings in these different times have access to one another? Why should I think that a being in one time has access to another time that is completely and utterly discrete from it? So in the traditional understanding of God's omnipresence, God is wholly located at all points of space when those points of space exist. God is wholly present to all of space by his direct and unmediated cognitive and causal access to the universe. Or as Peter Lombard would say, God is present by his knowledge, power, and substance, which sustains creation and existence. And that is a fairly intimate relationship between God and the universe. And I haven't even mentioned anything like the doctrine of the Holy Spirit or the Incarnation. And those are all deeply intimate relationships between these two discrete times. So if this timeless present is a time that is truly discrete from our own, I should like to know how these discrete times can be related to one another in such a way that the Christian theologian can develop the whole of Christian doctrine whilst maintaining that these two times are genuinely distinct. It is not obvious how this is supposed to work based on what Leftow said today. Okay, so let me move on to Robin's paper. So I found this very interesting. And there are because there are a lot of different recent attempts to discuss the compatibility between an internalist ontology of time and Christian theology. And I've got quite a few friends who are actually working on projects to show that eternalism is not merely compatible with Christian theology, but it's actually really fruitful for articulating the whole scope of Christian doctrine. I don't think it's going to be fruitful. In fact, I think it's going to be an absolute disaster. But that's just me. So here's one of the things that I think is being ignored here by a lot of contemporary thinkers trying to articulate the compatibility of these things. There's a lot of metaphysical baggage that comes with eternalism. And a lot of these entailments have not been thought through for Christian doctrines, such as a doctrine of atonement. So for our purposes today, I just want to say that I think there's another version of this thank goodness that is over objection that can be developed once we consider all of the metaphysical baggage that comes with eternalism. One of the most crucial bits of baggage that comes is with regards to philosophical and theological anthropology. In particular, the issue of personal identity over time. See, the Christian doctrine of atonement is, in part, about the reconciliation of divine persons with human persons. So the entailments of eternalism for personal ontology are very relevant to the doctrine of atonement. Most, but not all, philosophers think that eternalism entails some version of what is called four-dimensionalism, or a doctrine of temporal parts. And the most common views are what are called Perdurantism or stage theory. On Perdurantism, a human person is a collection of temporal parts, or person stages. So for example, the Apostle Peter has numerically distinct person stages at each instant of his existence. So there's a Peter at this time, and at this time, and at this time, and so on, and so on, and so on. Whereas on stage theory, on Perdurantism, like all those temporal parts are those person stages that exist at each instant. The collection together somehow is just Peter. Whereas on stage theory, the Apostle Peter just is a momentary person stage, just a person stage that exists at one instant and one instant only. And he has a whole bunch of other temporal counterparts that exist at all those other instances. So think of it in slightly different terms. How many Ryans have you been listening to at this one moment? On stage theory, an infinite number of them. On Perdurantism, there's an infinite number of parts of me at all those different instances, but there's just one me, somehow, sort of. Okay, so now, as I've argued elsewhere, it is not clear that four-dimensionalism is compatible with the Christian doctrine of atonement. So if you assume eternalism and four-dimensionalism, there are a large number of person stages that are eternally located at times prior to Christ reappearing. And that means that there are a large number of person stages who will never come to enjoy the eternal resurrection of the dead, nor the full reconciliation with God that reaches its completion at the eschaton. In fact, there are a large number of person stages that are eternally located at moments of great suffering, and those suffering person stages will never receive the eschatological healing that is said to come with Christ's redemption. So those person stages can never say, thank goodness that is over. And I think that's a very serious problem for any understanding of atonement. These person stages are not in a position to experience being at one with God, and they never will, for they are eternally fixed at times that are prior to the eschaton. And so I think this makes it very difficult to maintain that through Christ, God is reconciling the world to himself. So if one wishes to tout the compatibility of eternalism with the atonement, one must address the issues of personal ontology as well, all the metaphysical baggage that comes with eternalism. Okay, so Joseph's paper. Now, I did not have access to this ahead of time, so I'm shooting from the hip here. So one of the things that I think is worthy of note is that within Christian theology, we have almost 2,000 years of reflection on divine timelessness and trying to figure out how exactly can a timeless God interact with the world. We do not have that much reflection on how this is supposed to work on divine temporalism. Around the Reformation, we get a handful of divine temporalists pop up, like Samuel Clarke, Isaac Newton, and John Tillotson. But no one really develops those models until you kind of get to the 20th century. And even then, there's not a whole lot of development until mid-21st century, well, not mid-21st century, because we're not in the mid-21st, early 21st century. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in trying to figure out exactly how does temporalism work. And what we see in Joseph's presentation today is we see a couple of the options here. We've got some options from William Lane Craig, who says that God is timeless sans creation, temporal with creation. I really honestly do not know how that is supposed to work. And lots of people have brought this up, saying, how exactly do we make sense of this claim? So I'm happy to set that one aside. So the two main contenders, I think, are something like Richard Swinburne's view, which is sometimes called the Oxford School of Divine Temporality, which is a claim that God has the state of affairs prior to creation where there's no changes whatsoever, this pure duration account, and then change, succession, those enter into once God creates the universe. The other option would be something like Paget and DeWeese, where we've got this claim that prior to creation, God does actually have succession in his life, or some sort of metrication in his life. How does that work? I don't entirely know yet. So these are some questions that I have for Joseph's paper. So first question I have is, if God's life necessarily involves succession, how do we deal with issues related to like the Kalam argument? So if the past is infinite, can we actually have a truly infinite past? How do we deal with those sorts of issues? Another issue is, how exactly is God related to this absolute space? In some passages in Isaac Newton, it appears as if like space and time are attributes of God. And I can actually, I found this earlier in some medieval thinkers as well, like Nicole Orsamy, who says like time and space just are attributes of God. Is that what we're supposed to kind of understand this as? If that's the case, then we might be somewhat worried that that view entails panentheism. Some people are going to be happy with panentheism. Other Christian theologians and philosophers might not be. I'm not going to tell them how to think about that. If they want to be a panentheist, go for it. But there might be other options. Samuel Clarke has this letter where he's dealing with this objection of, are space and time attributes of God? And he says, no, that's to speak in the vulgar, and we don't want to speak in the vulgar, I assume. So he says that space and time are necessary concomitants of God's nature somehow. Not entirely sure how that's supposed to work, what that means, but that might be an option for exploration. So maybe that's something Joseph would like to say. Again, I'm not certain. Like I'm saying here, divine temporality needs a lot of work to be really fleshed out. And so the final question I have for Joseph, and I'll end on this point, is why did God not create sooner? This is an objection that like Leibniz brought up against Samuel Clarke, and it's a common objection against divine temporality today. Why did God not create sooner? People in the Oxford school, like Swinburne or Dean Zimmerman, they can say, look, there's no change taking place prior to creation. There's no way to develop a metric or a clock prior to creation. So there's no question of sooner or later. There's just God there, and there's no way to even make sense of that question. So we sidestep the problem altogether. But on Joseph's view, he can't say that because he wants to say time is necessarily metricated. There's this necessary succession and metrication prior to creation. So the question is very serious. Why did God not create sooner? Again, since I'm just shooting from the hip here, here's one possible way he might get out of this. So Samuel Clarke, his response to Leibniz's objection was just to say, God didn't, there's no reason to create at one time versus any other time. All these times are equally good prior to creation. His principle of sufficient reason was not as strong as Leibniz's was, so he did not see a problem here. He might be able to say something like this. Keith Yandell has an account somewhat like this, where he says, look, prior to creation, any time is good as any other to create. Is it an arbitrary act for God to create at any time? Sort of. It's what Keith Yandell calls a nested arbitrary decision. It is nested within a rational decision to create. So God has good reasons to create. Any time is good as any other to create. So it's arbitrary in the sense of I have to select one time versus any other, but it doesn't really matter because that decision's arbitrary, but it's nested within this perfectly rational choice to create a universe. There might be something there to really develop and work that out. I don't know. We'll have to see. So, thank you.